remotely. I wish we could be there.
Professor Christian KETELS, the visiting executive at Harvard's Business School, Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of the Innovation Fund Denmark, CEO of CK Business Economics AB. He will start with his presentation, Acting Now While Preparing for Tomorrow, Competitiveness Upgrading Under the Shadow of COVID-19.
Well, welcome everyone. It's an honor to be part of this meeting. As Michael Porter, I first of all would like to congratulate our organizers in the Ukraine at Min Business School for hosting these meetings. A very warm welcome to our MOC colleagues. I also want to welcome the broader audience of Ukrainians and others that this virtual meeting allows us to reach out to. What I want to do is to really build on Michael Porter's presentation and try to tackle the question of how does the COVID pandemic affect our thinking about competitiveness, and how should it influence the way that we design competitiveness strategies of our economies. There's a lot of talk at the moment about how do we respond to this crisis. There's also a lot of talk about how we build back better. I firmly believe that the competitiveness framework has the potential to help us give better answers to this call, to help us really design policy responses that can deal with the very difficult situations that many of our economies are facing. I also see this presentation as hopefully a starting point of a dialogue with our Ukrainian colleagues about what can be done in that country. Ukraine sits in a very difficult geographic location. It is an important country. It is one that we all want to succeed sitting here as a European. I would like to work with you and find out what the ways are in which we can increase Ukrainian competitiveness further. This is not a short haul. This is a long process that needs to start. It's something that ultimately the Ukrainians will drive themselves, and you're very capable of doing that. But maybe these ideas that Professor Porter introduced about competitiveness, about shared prosperity, can help you along the way. Let me now share the presentation and get into our discussion. So at the moment, we're really in a situation where there are a lot of questions and very few good answers. We don't know how bad this second wave of infections is going to be. We've seen scary numbers in parts of the US. We've certainly seen scary numbers in parts of Europe, especially Spain. So far, luckily, the mortality rates have not been going up, but we don't know how this pandemic is going to play out. We don't know when we'll have a vaccine, so we quite frankly don't know how long it will be that we'll have to deal with this limbo. This is what the economists called the 90% economy, very different type of reality that we weren't used before. That will have an impact on how quickly our economies can go back. It will have an impact on what type of policy actions are necessary and how sufficient, how effective they are going to be in improving our lives and improving the success of our companies. I think for those of you that are business leaders, there's also big question marks about how your industries will look like once we're out of this, once we're post-COVID. Change. How will rivalry change? How will consumer behavior change? And all of this, and this is really a mantra for the competitiveness framework, how should that inform our actions? I will go against my academic instincts, which is a lot about slow analysis and trying to kind of ponder the pros and cons of different arguments, stick my head out with a couple of observations on what I think that could inform the answers to these questions. First of all, in the economy, I think we're going to experience what I would call a square root recovery. We are going to bounce back quickly. We've already seen that happening in parts of the world. But we are also going to see a permanent loss of economic activity in most of our countries. And that's bad news, certainly for those countries that were already struggling. It's also bad news for those of us who've seen slower trend growth ahead, and that was true for both the US and Europe. Macroeconomic policy has been the focus of a lot of the discussion, but I'm confident that while that is really necessary and why it was the right focus first, it's on its own not sufficient to overcome the COVID shock. We also need to look at the supply side, at the microeconomic side of how our economies look like. And therefore, having the right type of strategy for building back better ultimately has to be a competitiveness strategy. But it has to be a competitiveness strategy that really realizes and acknowledges the changes around us. A lot of people talk about crisis as an opportunity. I think, yes, that's possible, but we have to recognize that on average, we are worse off after a crisis. We will only be better off if the crisis gets us to do things that we were not able to do or not willing to do before the crisis. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about clusters. Clusters is a key part of our framework. It's a key part of what makes the concept of competitiveness tick. And I think it is a powerful instrument that we should use as we respond to this crisis and build back better. Finally, one of the things that this crisis has brought home is that we need to think a little bit more about our resilience. We probably have to prepare more in the future about different types of potential scenarios and outcomes. So rather than predicting one outcome and prepare for that, maximize for that scenario, being a bit more prepared to deal with different types of outcomes will be critical. So let's start with the economic outlook. I think one of the issues that economists were struggling with is trying to understand the nature of this pandemic. Especially in the OECD countries, we had a lot of experience with economic crisis, recently financial crisis, debt-driven crisis, sometimes deflationary crisis. Those are usually kind of some misfunctioning in the economic mechanisms, some overheating, some misfunctioning of the financial markets. They can take a lot of time to recover, getting the economy back to equilibrium, but they are not connected with really a destruction of the underlying capacity of the economy. Wars and natural disasters are another type of shock, and they came more to mind when thinking about COVID. In those situations, it's really a combined demand and supply shock. You can't produce and offer, you can't consume, but you also don't want to consume in those situations. Importantly, it's also a situation where often physical infrastructure or even the workforce is destroyed or killed, and so we have long-term effects out of this. COVID is sort of a bad mix of the two. It started out as more of a supply and demand side shock, like a war or natural disaster, but one that was global in scope. But now it's turning more and more into an extended economic crisis because of the depth of the downturn that we've seen from this pandemic playing out. What does that mean for the economic outlook, the type of scenarios? You might recall that especially around March and April, there was a lot of discussion about different letters. Are you going to see a V-shaped recovery or an L-shaped recovery or U-shaped recovery? It's all about different combinations of whether or not we're going to lose output, whether or not we're going to be operating at a lower level of prosperity, or whether or not we're also going to see a hit to the growth rate. Combinations of these three factors basically describe whether we are at V, which is the optimistic outcome, kind of a quick recovery back to the old level of growth, still with some losses in output. So what you see in this triangle is not regained, not as in the usual cycle of the economy where you would then see an overshooting of economic activity, but still back to the new normal. We can move beyond that crisis. L is sort of the worst outcome. Not only do we see a loss of the output in the time of the crisis, but we also end up with permanently lower growth rate, and there's really no recovery. At the moment, I think the square root type of recovery seems most likely. We have seen a quick uptick in economic activity in many economies. So following this blue line after the initial slowdown in connection with the lockdowns of many economies. But we're also now seeing signs that this recovery, that this uptick is not going to take us back to where we would have been without the crisis. And it might indeed be that the disruption that the pandemic has created could even move us to a lower growth rate. So that's the type of scenario that I think we need to prepare for. What's behind that? What are the dynamics? What are the pluses? Why might this crisis actually turn out to be less severe? But what are also the factors that kind of are holding us back, that might create more risks? On the positive side, we've seen an unprecedented level of fiscal and monetary policy response in many countries. Basically, everybody was willing, not everybody was able, because of the fiscal space that countries had to respond, but there was a very strong response that we've seen. We were also in a situation where the balance sheets of firms, banks, and households, but also the general level in prices and wages, were not out of whack dramatically before the crisis. Now remember, that's usually what drove the past economic crisis, at least in the OECD economies. Balance sheets were overextended because of debt before the last crisis. Historically, we often had situations with high inflation or maybe a misaligned exchange rate that need to be adjusted. None of this was the case here, so the recovery does not need a period to restabilize and replenish balance sheets. There's also no real impact on the capital stock or on the labor force. All of these factors are positive and should enable us to go back relatively quickly to the pre-crisis situation. What is negative and what might actually lead us to a worse outcome is that this crisis has affected across many sectors, unusually, especially the labor-intensive sectors. Usually in economic downturns, we see investment goods and capital goods being hit much harder. This time it was really services and labor-intensive, high employment sectors that were impacted. It was a global crisis, much unlike other wars or natural disasters. And there is still a lot of uncertainty about where we go from here. We don't know when this pandemic will be beat in terms of the healthcare response. In the advanced economies in particular, we also were in a situation where trend growth was already down. We saw that very clearly in Europe. And I think in the US, it was only temporarily overshadowed by the stimulus provided by the tax increases. But it's this combination of factors that explains why we are in a situation where I think a square root recovery might be most likely. Now, in thinking about the policy response, it became apparent that you have to think about different phases of the response. First was the crisis response. We really need to get our healthcare system in order. We need to deal with those cases. We need to flatten the curve, make sure that there is not more incidences of COVID-19. We're now in the second phase, where it's much more about living with the pandemic. So a more de-averaged approach. We're back to more normal activity in our societies and our economies, but the virus is still there. We still need to deal with some restrictions, and we need to make sure that that happens while minimizing the long-term impact and cost to our economy. The third step, and actually the one that I will focus on most, is then how do we ignite growth after this crisis? How do we at least move back to where we've been before, but ideally actually end up with a better situation, given also the problems that Mike Porter talked about in terms of rising inequality and actually the failure to generate share prosperity in many economies. Now, what are the tools that are being used? You know, if you think here about this whole mix from public health to social policy to macroeconomics to microeconomics, it's important to think about how the priorities of these tools has changed over time during this crisis. So focusing on the economics, macroeconomic policy in the beginning was really focused on avoiding a total financial market meltdown, which could have happened and which was a big concern on the global financial crisis. That was very successfully averted. We saw some outflows of capital from emerging economies, but it could have been much worse. And a country like the Ukraine has kind of seen these things happen in the past. Now it's a lot about mobilizing financial resources again. It's surprising how quickly the macroeconomic discussion moved from talking about debt sustainability to basically seeing as more, the more debt, the better. There's no problem in refinancing and so on within just a couple of weeks. The next stage will be, how do we make sure that we are not after this end in a depression. There were already concerns about this before the crisis, that we basically end up in a vicious circle where people consistently consume too little. We're not using our productive resources. That will be a drag on investment and so on. And so we might end something that see us grow at very low levels. This could even be a depression. So those are the things that were on the mind of macroeconomists. It's a lot about stabilization. It's very broad-based general policies. And it's something that's really focused on the demand side. On the microeconomic side, it looked like that was less important, but it quickly turned out that even initially, we had to focus a lot on micro. First, it was about keeping value chains operational. People started to close their borders. It was very hard to get the type of personal protective equipment that was needed. Even within Europe, we saw borders being closed. That was then changed, and actually the value chains survived much better than many people had expected. We're now in the process of having to think about safe operational environments. Turns out that that is not a kind of one-size-fits-all issue across the economy. It's really something that you have to think about sector by sector, location by location. And for the next stage, it will be about how do we enable innovation and productivity growth? What is it that we can do to get our economies back on track on these issues? It's not only that these are different policy areas, it's also that this is a very different nature of policy problem, because it is firm specific, it's sector specific, it's location specific. So the type of thinking that you need in order to address microeconomic issues is different and complementary to what you need on the macroeconomic side. Long term, it's about stimulating growth. It's about increasing resilience, so being able to deal with different types of shocks. But it is really about how do we enhance competitiveness in a sustainable way moving forward. Many economies have achieved short-term growth spurts. This is not what this is about. The question is rather, how can we ensure that our machine to generate growth is for the long run working more smoothly and can generate higher outcomes? What's the MOC model that we have in mind? And Michael Porter already talked a little bit about that. Here's kind of an easy, almost engineering type view on how you might think about that. What we have as inputs is really two different things. There's one green box, which is kind of the conditions that you create in your economy, your skills, your infrastructure, your rules and regulations, the way that you collaborate and so on. That really sets the microeconomic competitiveness context. But it is not only that, it is also what you have inherited, where you are as a geography, who your neighbors are, whether you're landlocked, whether you're an island, whether you're close to rich neighbors, whether you're close to friendly neighbors. But it's also natural resources and the institutional legacy of your economy. These are all very important factors that will shape how the assets and capabilities that you create will ultimately drive prosperity. What they then affect is really what you do in your economy, what sectors you have, what industries you're in, what firms are successful in your environment, and how good they are. This is an important question because a lot of people kind of get confused by the very strong evidence that richer countries are in different industries and do different things than poor countries. But this is, in our view at least, largely a reflection of changes in the underlying competitiveness. So it's not only just by saying we are an automotive producer that you get more prosperous or rich. No, you become an automotive producer because you have different types of capabilities and skills. That allows you then to be a good automotive producer, a productive and innovative automotive producer, and that ultimately drives your prosperity. Microeconomics, and that makes it hard, this green box, is actually a lot of smaller things. You know, it's like a complex puzzle where each of these different things also interact with each other. It's a lot about the business environment, you know, what usually World Bank or the OECD are quite focused on, from skills to infrastructure to energy to access to capital and so on. But it is also about cluster presence, so whether you have specialized suppliers and service providers and how closely you work together. And it ultimately also is about how good you are as managers, how good your strategies are, your value chains, your operations, the nature of your competitive advantages. competitiveness, microeconomic competitiveness is not the one killer application that you need. It's about orchestrating all of these things in the right way. How do you upgrade competitiveness? Well, what we've learned over the last couple of decades is, first of all, that it of course is about what actions you take. Many things matter. There's no silver bullet, so it's really about this orchestration. What matters depends on your context. So only because one other country succeeds by, let's say, a big innovation push, doesn't mean that that's the right thing for you. You have to understand where you are. Every location is different, and that needs to be reflected. But the competitiveness framework provides a lens, a language that is actually universal, and that can allow you to understand what needs to be done. I would argue that people have gotten pretty good at figuring out what needs to be done, and that often is not the problem of raising competitiveness. It's the how. This is where it gets really difficult. One challenge is that almost any economy needs to change many things, but making all those changes at once is impossible. And so the more you try, the higher the likelihood that you will fail, that it's not going to work out. So the question is, how can you sequence your activities in the right way? Where to start? What should come next? It's a very important path to success. Success is also about strength and not just weaknesses. This is obvious often to business leaders because businesses are around their unique strength. That's what defines a strategy. But not so much to economists, because we usually talk about market failures, about the weaknesses that need to be removed. That's also important, but is often not enough to create success. And finally, and I think that's an important message for everyone in government, change requires action by many. It's not something that you can just decide by instituting a law or financing program. It requires many people to make choices in their areas of expertise, the areas of decision-making in a coordinated fashion. How do you build then such a strategy? How do you build a strategy that achieves that and really allows us to come out of this crisis in a better way? First, it's about diagnostics, really understanding where you are. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Then it's about choice. So this is not a math problem. Countries do need to decide what they want to compete on, where they want to compete, what the priorities are that they are setting for themselves to achieve certain types of economic outcomes. And only then can you make your choices about what actions are right and what sequence, and importantly, who should do it, who is really in charge of implementing. Let's talk a little bit at the diagnostics. What we usually look at is what is in the middle. What are the endowments? What are these competitiveness fundamentals that I talked about? How is that reflected in sectors and clusters? How is that then driving certain types of economic activity in terms of employment, investment, FDI, exports, and so on? And how is that then translated into prosperity outcomes? It's important to see that there are two new dimensions outside of this central strain of analysis that we also need to look at. On the right-hand side is how are we influencing the competitiveness fundamentals through our policy actions and architecture. This is where we need to make changes. The result will then be shown in the competitiveness fundamentals. We have to think about how the crisis affects our ability to improve our policy actions and architectures. And then on the left-hand side, the value of what we have to offer also depends on how the market looks like. Think about an easy example. Nokia had a lot of expertise in the old type of telecom business, the old types of cell phones. When the global technology changed and global consumer behavior changed, all of a sudden that knowledge was worth much less because people flocked to smartphones and Apple and other types of devices. So it's not only how you changed, but it's also how the world changes around you. For the Ukraine to start such a process, I think in terms of the diagnostics, there's a lot of data around. Here are some from the Global Competitiveness Report. And you can go through performance, to the competitiveness, to the endowments. You are a country that has had a very difficult economic history. The last couple of years look better in terms of positive growth rate before COVID. There was also a dramatic reorientation of trade to Europe, which I think is quite remarkable. Unfortunately, I think it partly is overshadowed by the drop of trade with Russia, and understandably given the political context. A lot of reforms, a lot of things that were done, often not for 100%, but there's been movement in many of these areas. But I think clearly you have been affected by the legacy of your geographic location, the conflict with Russia and the East, and in Crimea, the legacy of oligarchic groups in your economy, and so on. So a very complex situation, certainly, to look at in the Ukraine. How's that picture changed by COVID, not just for the Ukraine, but also others? Traditionally, we looked at this green and red box, so the outcomes and the competitiveness fundamentals. I don't think they have fundamentally changed, certainly not the green box, by COVID. The outcomes, yes, but that depends a little bit on how we respond to the shock. What really has changed is the global economic context and potentially also the policy making context. Let me talk a little bit about these two in turn. One of the biggest changes that this crisis could institute is that it really affects some of the big trends that were already ongoing. Digitalization is one of them. We know that the adoption speed has tremendously increased on the consumer side, but also within the value chains within companies. We don't quite know what will stay and what will go back to normal, but it looks likely that there is really a step change in digitalization. You have to think through what that means in terms of the demand and value of certain skills and capabilities that you offer. You have to think through how that affects the competitive positioning of your companies and the attractiveness of certain sectors that you're in. There are other changes, like changes in globalization, the move of economic activity to China, the potential reorganization of global value chains, what it might do to global trade policy, a new macroeconomic context. The list goes on and on. You have to think through much more these changes. And I think that's true not only for the Ukraine, that's true for all of us. What is it really that has changed around us that affects our competitiveness is much more important than only analyzing what we've done within our own economies. The other factor is the policymaking context. And this really relates to this question about whether a crisis is an opportunity. So we looked in this together with a colleague of mine last year. What we found is that if you look at longer term trends of competitiveness changes and productivity changes, what you see is that macroeconomic crises actually on average are negative. Not a big surprise maybe. You are seeing lower competitiveness gains and you are seeing on average lower competitiveness improvements. But there's an important edge to this observation. And that edge is that after deep crisis, we see what we call here this fat right-hand tail. So there's a significant number of cases where locations have been able to turn a crisis into an opportunity. And usually, and that I think was an observation first by Moc Model after the Second World War, it is when blocking institutions that hold back reforms are kind of shaken up by the crisis. So there's a different political equilibrium and different types of reform become possible. So if we hope for this crisis to be an opportunity, we have to think about and understand whether it actually has shaken up the political equilibrium for reforms or against reforms. So it connects a little bit to the discussion that Mike Porter started on the role of the political system. If we take all these things into account and talk about diagnostics, where do we end up? Well, we hopefully are able to design a strategy that has a clear outcome ambition. What do we want to achieve? What are our aspirations for our country? What is our value proposition? What do we stand for as an economy? That's often missing in many economic plans. Politicians are better in setting high prosperity gain goals, but are not so clear about what's the value that they actually want to provide for firms as a location to do business. That's absolutely critical because it's the step to prosperity, but also because it guides our prioritization of action plans, both cross-cutting and cluster-specific. And finally, there needs to be a delivery structure that then really helps us to make sure that this strategy is more than paper, it's more than a promise. It really is a change driver. One quick example that shows a little bit how clusters fit into this and how clusters are actually not separate from a national competitiveness strategy. This is the biopharmaceutical initiative in Singapore. It was really heavily embedded in the overall strategic positioning of Singapore as sort of an OECD business environment in an emerging market context with access to these huge and growing markets across Asia. They identified that with their base, they should be able to move much more into biopharmaceuticals. They already had chemicals, they had large manufacturing, they had headquarters of pharma companies, but they didn't really have research. And they then had a long-term strategy to really build first research capabilities, then translational capabilities to put this into products and services. And now they are focused much more on innovation and startups and so on. So it is about using clusters in two ways. First, leveraging the assets that you have more broadly created in your economy to create specific economic value and activity, but also use this cluster as a trailblazer that changes the perception and reality of that broader business environment to others. So now we see Singapore as an entrepreneurial hub, certainly also as a much more knowledge-driven hub than before, when it was mainly about efficient infrastructure and capital-intensive industries and logistics and so on. Clusters were at the beginning of the pandemic actually seen as maybe not so relevant. They were small, they're focused on SMEs, much on the supply side, had little formal power or resources and so on. The focus was really on the macro side, on central governments and getting the public health response right. But it turned out that these type of clusters and cluster organizations actually were very powerful throughout the response to the crisis. And TCI, a network that I'm closely associated with of cluster organizations globally, with also some Ukrainian members, I should say, put a lot of these experience together. What we found is that clusters were enormously important because they provided the quick connections, especially to SMEs, but also to other companies. They had trust, flexibility, speed. They knew what was going on in the real world in their sectors and in their regions. They were able to turn around production to quickly address needs in terms of personal protective equipment, to understand what companies needed to kind of change their production and so on. So clusters were both a tool for the long-term competitiveness of a location, but they are also a very important tool in the short-term response. Prepare more, predict less. So I talked about a framework on how you think about a microeconomic strategy to build back better after the pandemic. I talked about the outline of a strategy of the role that clusters could play in such a context, of how the pandemic really has changed the context in which we operate. One cross-cutting change driver is uncertainty. It's not that we don't know anything, but there's a lot of things we don't know about when changes will happen and how strong certain changes are to be. Some people argue that, the only response to that is flexibility and resilience, be ready for anything and just be nimble. I believe that strategy is actually more important than that. You need to have a North Star. You need to know the direction. You can be flexible and effective if you know what your ultimate goal is. So an economic policy needs to be not just a list of individual actions, because that actually does get outdated even more quickly now than it was 5 years ago. But it needs to be around an ambition and a value proposition that can stay, even if the actions always have to be adjusted and be flexible to the circumstances. That also means you need evidence. Uncertainty doesn't mean the absence of evidence or facts. You constantly need to update your understanding of the environment and recognizing that there is genuine uncertainty and risk, but you need data to do that. It's also about heterogeneity. We've started in the pandemic to think only about the big picture impact of the macro issues, but it's really about the heterogeneity, the differences. Impact that have been different by country, by industry, by size of company, by whether you're in a city or in a rural area. If we are effective in our response, we need to recognize these heterogeneities. And this is where clusters are so important, because they allow us to really peek into the specific context that exists around your company, in your region, and in your economy. So I hope that is a useful starter for this discussion, not only for today, for the great panel that we're awaiting, but also for a dialogue in the Ukraine and in other countries. We still need to learn how we have to adjust our competitiveness thinking to the pandemic and to the presence of COVID. But this is a starting point. If you want to read more, there's also a working paper that my colleague Peter Clinch and I did at the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. So there's a little bit more detail there. Let me stop sharing and then hand it back to my colleagues for our further discussion. We're going to have a panel discussion now. Arturo Breeze will join us a little bit later. Pavel Klimkin, I'm very glad to see him here as well. I know he had some health issues, but is strong on the video. And then my good colleague Fernando Alberti, Professor Fernando Alberti from the MLC network, who was kind enough to actually offer to take over the moderation of our session. I will stay